It's a great honor, but also a great emotionally profound moment for me to speak in the seminar series named after, co-founded, but named after Carl, our dear friend. He had a profound influence on my own research, and but also as a friend and colleague. I really appreciate having this initiative of theoretical neuroscience worldwide seminar series named after him. So my talk is about geometry of concept learning. Before I start, I would like to introduce my colleagues. Those are the people that are my colleagues' collaborations on several projects which are aimed to develop understanding of the neural representations of, I would say, higher visual cognition beyond simple features like orientation and motion, etc. So Dan Lee from Cornell Tech and Samsung, an old longtime colleague and friend. Suyun Chang was a PhD at the time at Harvard. She's now assistant professor at NYU and at Flatiron. Dr. Uri Cohen, he's now a postdoc in Cambridge. This was is a part of his PhD. And then more recent young colleagues, Ben Sorcher, PhD at Surya Ganguli's lab, Shane Chang, a PhD jointly with Gabriel Kaiman at Harvard, and Naoki Hiratani, a postdoc at Harvard. And of course, acknowledging the support. There are wide-ranging projects, but what I'm going to talk today is specifically or mostly the work, the joint work with Ben Sorcher. And this is about geometry of few-shot learning of object categories in vision and language. Most of what I would say is recently published, or you can follow more details in this paper. Okay, so let me say a few general comments about the neural learning of concepts. So the question of how humans and maybe animals learn or form concept is a classical long-time problem, starting in philosophy and science, in psychology, cognitive science, and neuroscience. I'll just remind you that the classical Aristotelian approach is that concepts are defined by a set of necessary and sufficient conditions. So if a stimulus obeys these sufficient and necessary conditions, a list of requirements that something has to be a tree, or something is a dog, or something is a cat or human being, and so on. This is the definition of a concept, and learning it, many basically learning those conditions. This is a long time has been discredited. There was the attempts to actually formulate or such list didn't really make any progress or led to any understanding of cognition. There were in modern times, there were two major schools in cognitive science and psychology. One is based on the idea of prototype learning, which means that a concept of a dog, we have in our mind and our brain a prototype, something like a typical dog, a typical form or shape or whatever of a dog. So this is a prototype, and whenever comes a stimulus, we compare it to the prototype, and if it's close enough to prototype dog, then we say it's dog. So it's based on the idea of storing a prototype and comparing stimuli to different prototypes. And the other one, somewhat competing, is exemplar learning. It says we just store examples of a concept, and we just compare. We require more and more examples, and we compare a new stimulus or to the closest exemplar. So it requires more storage. Somewhat sounds more sophisticated, maybe more accurate. They have different. There's some predictions from psychology about the performance or the speed of learning and the errors and so on. Can distinguish between the two. So there are papers saying, well, this is supporting prototype, supporting exemplar, and you will not be surprised that that later version says, well, it's both, or some humans do this, some other do this, or in general we do it in a mixture, and so on and so forth. I won't go into these details, but just to highlight this kind of basic question. Another question is how concepts which are abstract, how they are represented in different modalities, or are they represented? And if they are represented in different modalities, what unite them? So is there something like an abstract representation, or there are representations in vision, in audition, in language, and so on? And if there is a model representation of the same concept, then what connects them and what unite them? I will address both questions about concept learning, prototype, and so on, and the question of grounding of concepts. What is the relation between different representations of concept, if there are different representations of concept? Okay, so now let's go to do some work. What I will focus on is concept learning in the context of vision. So an object, a new object or category will be a concept in this context. And learning a new concept, first of all, and it's not original, to translate it into a discrimination task. So it's kind of hard and ill-defined, and to actually show an image to somebody and asking what is this concept, or name it, or if it's new, it doesn't know how to name it, or is it new, or is it old? This is hard and very somewhat ill-defined. It's easier to take a subject and to show the subject two categories, hopefully maybe unfamiliar to the subject. We can also give it a name. This is an image of a coati. This is an image of another animal called numbat. Let's say the subject have no prior experience and familiarity with this concept. So we bring the subject, we present the subject with two, let's call it training images. And then they are labeled, and then we are showing the test image on top and ask the subject, does this image looks like a coati or look like a number? So this, in technical terms, will be an example of one-shot learning. It's one shot because we're presenting one example, training example, only one per two categories, per the two new categories, and the human, also maybe animals, have to make a decision. Okay, so the question is how accurate this can be done, and what is involved in this, what are the neural machineries what is the neural machinery that's involved in it, and so on. So good. So this is one-shot learning. Here is four-shot learning. Four-shot learning is the case where we show, it's easier. We show 4 images per category. So I have 4 training images for coati, 4 training images for numbat, and now we have to say, now it's probably easier to see that this is indeed looks like a number, perhaps. Okay, now here it is 2-way. You can also extend it to 3-way categories or more, where we show a few examples from 3 options, so 4 options, and again a test image, and the subject has to decide which one it belongs to. But I'll speak most of the time on just 2-way, like here, one shot, few shot, and so on. Okay, so this is the task. Now, how do we go about it? What will be, we have to decide if we want to translate it into an algorithm, a neural algorithm, we have to decide what will be the model, the decision model. Okay, so here, for instance, we have 4 images of Kuati and 4 images of Numbat and a test image. And how do we decide, hypothetically, whether it is concept 1 or concept 2? And the algorithm that we are using is the following. We take all the images, propagate them into the into the visual hierarchy. So the first stage is kind of feed forward the simple approach. The first stage is the retina, then LGN, V1, V2, V4, some intermediate stage, and then at the end, IOT Cortex. So we pass them through this. We look at the IOT Cortex, the last layer. Each image is a point in this population activity space. Each image. We have 4 images for the training. So and for each category. So we have 4 images for the examples of equality and 4 images for the example of Numbat. And now what we do, we are doing prototype learning. What does it mean? We don't store the individual images as exemplars. We just say we take the average, the centroid, center of mass of these examples, and we form a centroid X bar A representing now the prototype of the new object A, Kuati, and similarly for Numbat. So we have these 2 vectors. We throw away the examples. We just keep the 2 vectors. And now the test image comes here. The test image, we just compare it to the centers. And if the image is close in this feature space, if the image is close to B, then we say it's B. If the image is close to the centroid, the prototype A, we say A. So that's that's the rule. That's our decision rule. So you can think about it as in neural language, we have a hyperplane perpendicular to a vector, kind of a linear discriminator vector W. It is just bisects the displacement vector between the 2 prototypes orthogonally, and then everything which is on one side of the hyperplane, it's going to be classified as A, and everything in the other side is B. This is our decision rule. Very simple, and that's the way we are implementing the prototype idea in a concrete algorithm, neural algorithm. Okay, so there is a math, but the math is very simple. You take the examples, you form the prototypes X bar X by B, and it is like a perceptron classifier. Very simple. All right. Okay. So how good is this? So how do we? So we first look at artificial neural networks, deep convolutional neural networks. We take convolutional neural networks are pre-trained on ImageNet, the famous ImageNet competition. So there are about 1 million images and 1,400 categories, organized in 1,400 categories. We take deep convolutional networks which are pre-trained, they're doing this task well. And then we take their feature layer. So these are examples of these networks. And then we don't have much data on the real brain. So we take this, we do the same as proxy by taking the pre-trained deep convolutional networks, propagate the images, looking at the feature layer, kind of the last layer before the classifier layer, and do this. And now we have enough data to actually compare. Why do we have data that we can compare with? This is because the ImageNet database is actually much larger than the 1 million images and 1,400 categories that are used for training those networks. There are many million images and corresponding, organized to many different categories, which are called held out. So those images are not held out images, usually for the same categories, usually used for validation, for tests. I'm talking about images that belong to held out categories. So the networks have never seen any example of these categories. This is why it is justified to call them kind of learning new concepts. And we do this, and the first surprise, at least to us, was that the performance is amazingly good. So here is the distribution of errors. So we have many pairs of held out categories like Numbat and Coati and so on and so forth. We have many pairs, many images. We do this many times, and we have a histogram. So the overall mean error, let's say for ResNet 50, which is our favorite kind of default network, is 98%. This is for 5-shot learning. Accuracy, 98%. For untrained is almost chance. If you take the same architecture, but you don't train, you just use the initializing random weights, it's 56%. If you take the pixel layer and you try to do it on the images themselves, it's slightly better than chance, but even better the untrained ResNet, the feature layer of untrained ResNet, but still it's very poor, 66%. And here you see the histograms of the error. So it's the error, how well the trained ResNet is doing in this task is amazing. Okay, so that's the first surprising. So the question is, what is required in terms of the representation to generate such wave? What controls the performance on shot task? Okay, so for here we go back to the theoretical desk. Forget about ImageNet, forget about deep convolutional networks, but we take some very simple-minded toy model that we assume that we have high n-dimensional space. We assume that we have two objects represented as two ellipsoids. Basically, they have centers, true centers, x0. So on the right-hand side, you have the two ellipsoids. They have the true centers is x0, x0a, x0b. They have radii. They have a dimension. So they have UIA are the principal axis of manifold A, and UIB the principal axis of manifold B. So these are just the vector axis, the basis, and then the radii for A and B are basically the principal radii, the extent of the ellipsoid in each one of the principal axis, as you see in this example. So these two manifold are our generative model for two categories, for two objects, simply ellipsoid with these statistics. And now what we do, we ask what happens if you take this and you just sample randomly a few points from ellipsoid A, a few points from ellipsoid B, and you do this linear classifier by bisecting the prototypes, and how will you do? So you can see from the left-hand side that when X bar A and X bar B are only approximation, they're not, and you don't have full control of the geometry, you just have these centroids, then you will get some error. There will be the hyperplane will bisect some of the volume in the wrong way. Okay, so the question is, can you estimate the error? And the answer is yes. So it's a relatively simple calculation. The important quantity is this h, which is the distance squared from of the example. Let's say example from the manifold A. Let's say the example really came from manifold A, so that's XA. Compare it, so the distance from X bar A, the distance from X bar B, these are the estimated prototypes. If it's bigger than 0, then it's fine. If it's less than 0, then there is error. I'm sorry, opposite. If the distance is bigger than B, then it's an error. So H bigger than 0 is an error because it means that the distance that it's closer to B than to A. And you can do this kind of calculate the mean of H and the variance of H, and so on and so forth. So I'll come to that in a minute, but I just want to define a few quantities. So as you see, the mean, sorry, before that. So the radii and radius and dimension will be turns out to be important quantities. So what do I mean by radius? So it turns out that the relevant measure of a radius of each one of these ellipsoids for this task is simply the mean radii along all the axes. So that's very, very, very simple and very intuitive. So this is RA, and similarly for RB. It turns out that the normalized distance, just the distance is not important, because you can just, everything, you can expand the entire space. There is no scale. So what is important is the normalized distance, the distance between the two true prototypes, the two centers, the true centers normalized by their radius, RA. So that's what we call delta X 0. The dimension is another important quantity. And here, for this task, it turns out, it is a result of the theory, it's not an assumption, that the relevant dimension is the participation ratio, which is well-known quantity in computational science and in statistics. It's simply the square of the total sum of the radii divided by the fourth moment of them. So that's kind of the effective number of dimension. Now, it's important that we are talking about dA and not about the actual number of dimensions that this ellipsoid span, because they may actually span the entire space. So they may have radii, they may have UI in n direction. But what controls their dimension is the effective participation ratio, which is much smaller than n, and actually is assumed in our calculation to be finite. So R and D and delta X, all these measures are finite in the limit of n goes to infinity. Okay, now another quantity which is important is the effective span. Again, the span may be the full space, but the effective span are the span, but weighted. Each direction is weighted by the radii. And now I go with this, and n is the number of examples per manifold. And now if I put everything here, this is the result what we get. So what we see here is the following: because the input, the decision variable has a mean and is Gaussian, has a mean and has standard and variance. So then the error is simply the tail of a Gaussian around this mean. So this is the famous h of x, and the argument of h is the signal to noise ratio. So I write it here. So the signal is the numerator, the noise is the denominator. So let's first look at the signal. So first of all, the signal, the first term is very intuitive. If the two centers of the manifolds are far relative to the radii, then the signal is larger. It's easier. That's clear. There is another term which is bias, which is maybe less clear, and this is shown. So the signal is shown downstairs in A, and the bias is shown here. The kind of what happens in the bias is that if you so this is a caricature for one-shot learning. So you have these two ellipsoids, and you have one point in one ellipsoid, another point in another ellipsoid, and you draw the hyperplane compared to that 2 points, and you have it here. So it turns out it's very easy to see that if the manifold, one manifold is bigger than the other, then the empirical decision boundary will be pushed towards the bigger manifold, and therefore there will be more errors. It will intersect more of the volume of that manifold. So you can see it here that if A has larger radius than B, then there is a negative bias, which means that it can be even worse than chance. So this is the bias term. It can be positive, can be negative, depending on the ratio of the radii. Okay, that you can, I think, intuitively understand. The noise is somewhat surprising. Okay, so the noise, the most important part of the noise It's most important because even in the case where this ellipsoid effectively live in different orthogonal spaces and they are orthogonal to each other, very simple geometry, still it is there. And it is the noise, this term of the noise is 1 over the dimension. And that's surprising because I would expect that the higher the dimension is, the harder the problem is. It turns out that for this task, the higher the dimension is, if the radius is the same, the higher the dimension is, the easier the task is. And again, here the figure down there C is attempting to explain it. You can see that after you have these 2 points, the 2 training points, the test points will have a distribution of projection along W, and that distribution will be actually narrower if the dimension is high. It's a very common central limit theorem argument about concentration of Gaussian variables. So the higher the dimension is, the less spread is, and the less chance that they will cross to the other side. So this is this term. This term has to do with signal to noise overlap, whether the span, the variability is orthogonal to the decision direction. This is this term, and this is with B, this is with A. Okay, now I want to just to mention one point is that you see many terms here divided by M, and M is the number of examples that you have for this task. So what happens is that when M goes to infinity, the bias drops. These 2 contributions downstairs for the noise also drop. The fact that they are suppressed by 1 over M means that they are the result of an error in the estimate of the prototype. The more examples we have, the better estimate we have of the true prototype, and therefore these terms are suppressed. The last term is not. The last term represents the fact that even if I have many examples, this prototype learning is not optimal. So here's the example, here's shown in D. Suppose I draw a W connecting the 2 prototypes, but the way I do it, because I don't see the entire shape of the ellipsoids, I draw it perpendicular. But if there is a tilt in the shape, then it's clear that it's less optimal. The optimal one would be to respect the tilt and to draw the optimal classifier respecting the actual orientation of the ellipsoid. So this term, the last term here, will limit the signal to noise and will generate residual error even if M is large. However, it turns out that for few-shot learning, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on, the other terms are actually dominant terms. Okay, so now we say, let's check if this is correct for data. Well, the data is not ellipsoids and whatever they are, we don't know. We can measure, it's complicated. But what we do is you have a distribution of errors for distribution, because given one new category, we have many other categories and we have many other samples. So for a laughing gull, we take many other held out categories and do this and so on. So we have a point here of the few-shot learning error, something between 0 and 1, and so on and so forth. And then we measure for each pair. When we do this, we measure the SNR from our formula, just by measuring the radii, doing PCA, and so on and so forth. Okay, and what you can see is that there is a perfect match between the theory, this ellipsoid-based geometry, and the actual error that actually happens. And it's not surprising that black-backed, another version of a gull, is harder to discriminate between laughing gull versus a pizza from a laughing gull. So pizza has almost 0 error, large SNR, and here the SNR is closer to 0, and so on and so forth. So it turns out here, there are many examples. It turns out there is a very good agreement. So it's not only our theory explains the mean error, but also explains in details which pairs of manifolds will have are easy to learn and which are harder to learn. Okay, so there are many. There are many things here that I would like to talk to about. Let me just mention one thing is that we did it over many deep convolutional networks, but also that we did it also for self-supervised trained networks. These are this SimClar here, and CLIP is some other complicated network. So even if the networks during training has not seen any label, it's just seen contrastive learning, those of you that know what you take, two pairs and so on, no labels have ever been given to the network. It is still doing this in amazing accuracy. All right. Okay. Time is running short. Okay. So we can, so I'm sorry, no, okay, before time is running short. Okay, well, I just want to say, so this is, what is shown here is supposed to show you that that the theory, not only in terms of SNR, you can actually dissect the dimensionality, the signal to noise, and actually show how it figures into computation. For instance, if you look at dimension, the histogram in the histogram at the left histogram is for pixel layer, so it's much lower dimension and therefore high noise. Whereas the histogram for trained, either held out or trained, are similar. Anyway, it's pushed to the so it's clear that part of the story is that the trained network has generated higher dimensional stimuli, okay, and so on. You can also look at the function of classes, but I don't have time for that. Okay, an interesting question is how this propagates through the layers. If you do this task, this learning, at what stage emerges this behavior? And so this is a function of the depth for ResNet 50, ResNet 152. This is the error. This is the normalized distance. You see that most of the improvement is in the later stages of the networks that we have also seen similar things in previous work on manifold geometry and so on. So it's consistent also here. Now I want to talk about correlation, about dimension specifically. So if we zoom in on the dimension, it's kind of interesting. The dimension is eventually becoming larger than the initial one, but it's kind of complex, non-monotonic as a function of the layers. So the input layer is the lowest dimension, then the dimension increases, then somewhat decreases again. Then it depends on the details, but that's a general trend. Ultimately, the dimension is higher, but it's in a non-monotonic fashion. This is to be contrasted with our previous work with Dan Lee and Chang on capacity and object classification tasks, not few-shot learning, not learning new concepts from a few examples, where the dimension started very high. It's the same images, the same type of images, ImageNet. Dimension started, look, here it is 12, here it is 50 or 70 and 80, and then maybe in non-monotonic fashion, but any very drastic reduction in dimension at the end. So it's a very different picture. And I just want to cut the story short. And the reason is that in object classification, we have many examples from each one of the many objects that you want to classify. The right thing to do is to decorrelate the common component, and then measure the dimension of the manifold and the decorrelated space. Where here we just have a few examples and two manifold, there is no sense, there is no way. We just do a very simple calculation to do this decorrelation. So this is a fully uncorrelated data. And therefore, the pixel layer is very strongly correlated, like we know images are, and then there is some decorrelation at the end. So it's a very different picture. I just want to highlight this because it means that what dimensionality is and how it changes and so on is something which depends on the task. The same data will have different answers depending on what type of computation you are doing. Okay, one more point about a prototype versus exemplar, and then I don't have time. I just want to say, it turns out, so you see here in D, prototype learning versus nearest neighbor, exemplar learning. I'm sorry, prototype is the bottom one. It turns out that when you have few examples, actually prototype learning is better than exemplar learning. It's actually superior. Only when you have many examples, then they start to be crossed. The exemplar is better. But in general, prototype learning, not in general, for few number of examples, okay. So now I want to very briefly say about neural data. We don't have much, but we have the Jim DeCarlos data, where monkey was viewing no task passively about thousands of images belonging to 64 objects, 40 samples images per object. We have about 180 neurons in V1 and in IT. And what we can do is do the same type of calculation about the neural representation of these images in IoT Cortex. And this is what you see here. Again, first of all, the theory, the SNR Geometric Theory, fits very nicely also to the performance of the neural representation IoT Cortex for this task, and also that there is a high correlation between the geometry, the SNR and signal and bias and so on, between the artificial neural networks, the feature layer, and the IoT Cortex. However, dimension surprisingly is very different. So here is again the trajectory of the dimension in the artificial neural networks, and here it is in the neural space. So in the real neurons. So we don't have V1, but you can take V1-like model by Gabor filters and do this. So it looks rather what you expect from previous stages. IoT Cortex is here. It is not far from, slightly below, not far from the dimensionality in the convolutional networks, and that's more or less fine. So the IoT Cortex, the feature layer, both in terms of performance, but in terms of the geometry, are rather close to deep convolutional networks. What is surprising that V4, this intermediate stage, is beyond everything else. So it's just outside the scale. So what happens, what is interesting is that the trajectory of dimensionality of the geometry, instead of going up and down, it's actually going down and up in the case of in the brain, and that's something that it's ongoing question research to understand that. Okay, I just would like to say also that it's related to dimension. There are discrepancy between the real biological data showing this power law dimension spectrum, PCA spectra of this type of images in the brain versus in the deep convolutional network that doesn't look like power law at all. So there is something to understand that. Finally, I want to say, I'm talking about geometry, I'm talking about dimension, I'm talking about radius, how sensitive it is to the number of neurons that you sample, the number of random projections that you use. How many neurons you have to include in IoT Cortex in order to reveal this geometry in terms of performance? And the answer is that the most important quantity is the dimension, which depends on M, which is the number of some sampled neurons, and has this behavior. So the dimension is lower. So dimension is lower if you have small number of samples. So as you see here, obviously it's bounded by the number of neurons, not number of neurons, not number of images, and it increases. So there is, if you want to call a finite size effect, but it's very quickly converges something close to the thermodynamic limit. Basically, once the number of neurons are large enough compared to the effective dimension, then you are done. Okay, so I want just to briefly, 5 minutes left, talk about language, because this is even more surprising to us and bizarre. This is called zero-shot learning. So what happens here? this means the following. We show the same query, the same image, but instead of showing 2 or few or 4 training images, we just give a linguistic descriptors. We are not generating, this is coming in the database. Every category has a linguistic descriptor, like a few words or a sentence and so on. So this is examples of these linguistic descriptors of each category. So now we show an image, one image, the test image, and we ask whether this image is Croati or numbered based on the language, on the linguistic descriptors. And so this is, how do we do this? The answer, algorithmically, how we handle this. So what we do is briefly, we take a word embedding, vector space embedding of words in the language. We take the whole batch of words, a bag of words, and vectorially sum them. So now we have one vector for each one of these categories. Simply vectorially sum the representation of individual categories. So here is an example. So this is the language representation. So now we have a set of vectors in the language representation, each one for each category. And similarly, we have in the visual representation. If you use that, and now I'm talking about the training data. So we take the training data, and for each one of these training categories, we compute the vectorial sum. So we have the true prototypes for each one of the training categories. So now we have, let's say, 1,000 vectors representing concepts in the visual representation and 1,000 vectors representing the same concept in the language representation. And now, and this is all about the train. And now what we do is ask what is the best linear mapping between the two sets of vectors. It turns out that the best is actually a rotation and a shift. So it is a very simple transformation between this set of representations and the visual set of representations. So we construct this rotation, we freeze it, and once we have this mapping, we're now taking the new category and find its vector in the language representation, use the frozen mapping to embed it into the visual feature representation, like here, and similarly for the other one. And now we construct our linear separator and make a decision, a zero-shot learning decision. That's all what we do. And again, I expect that this will be a total failure. It turns out it's very good. It's the performance is 93% accuracy, and again we have a corresponding SNR modified, but the same notion, ellipsoids and so on, with SNR, and you see that it fits very nicely. So we have a very good understanding of what's going on here, but that of course is based on the idea that we have a very nice alignment between the two sets of prototypes in the language and in vision. 93% is slightly better than one-shot learning and slightly worse than two-shot learning if you have images. So it's quite remarkable that you get such a performance. So my time is short. So there are many things that I would have loved to talk to you about, but I want to kind of summarize in the following way. That's more generally. First of all, that we know from this and from other work, previous work about object manifolds and deep convolutional networks, but these new results are consistent with the conclusion that you can think about what happens in the sensory hierarchy is reformatting the same data, the same information. You don't lose information, you don't gain information, but you reformat the representation of objects such that you have a compact manifolds at the feature layer for downstream computation. Computation is for whatever object-related computation. It can be classifying many objects like capacity calculation that we did in the past, or for learning new objects fast learning of new object, as I told you about today. So that's statement number one. It's important to note that both convolutional networks and, as far as we know, IOT Cortex don't collapse the manifolds into prototypes. There is still a manifold, and that's for me one obvious reason would be because the system, the downstream system, would be able to decode from the representations non-object identity calculation, computation, like extracting orientation, extracting other features from the object, which are kind of orthogonal to the object identity. So on one hand side you have a compact geometry for a category type of calculation and learning, and on the other side you keep information about physical variables, which are very often important also for downstream computation. Okay, so I showed you that this object manifold representations enable rapid learning of new object categories. They are the actual algorithm by which you make a decision on basis of a few examples. Actually, prototype learning is superior than other more sophisticated methods if you have only a few examples. And another thing that's remarkable that, as I show you briefly, is that the representation of the same concepts in different modalities. And remember, I started with saying, what is the grounding of object, kind of philosophical question. And here is a partial answer. The same representation, if I want to speculate about the brain, the same concepts are represented in different modalities, vision and language and maybe auditory and maybe touch, but there is a relatively simple transformation between these representations. This would be the prediction coming out of this zero-shot learning work that I've described to you. Another interesting question is the universality of the results. If I didn't have time to show you, but different convolutional networks, not only in terms of the performance, but actually in terms of the types of errors, they are very highly correlated. Which examples are, which new concepts are easier and or which are harder, are very consistent across different networks, but also across between networks and the data and the brain. Okay, so now I want to add by some more general philosophical statements about theoretical neuroscience. Okay, and this is and maybe this is also connecting to the balanced network work with Carl. And this is that, at least in my view, many of us what are looking for is kind of a coarse-grained theory of neural computation, rather than simulating networks with all the details and getting some results and copying the biology. That's not what we are aiming at. We're aiming at some abstraction, something which is coarse-grained, something which is more macroscopic, like E and I balance as an example. And what I am proposing is that in understanding higher order cognition, maybe geometric measures like dimension and radius in particular, of ensemble of pattern, not a single pattern, but an ensemble of patterns belonging to a category. Maybe this can be a coarse-grained, can be thought of as a coarse-grained order parameter of neural computation, something which is not simply dog and cat. It's lower level, but it's not looking at a single neuron. It's looking at geometry of ensembles of population patterns. And one reason why I think this might be a good set of other parameters is because, as I showed you briefly, they are very robust in terms of thermodynamic limits. You don't really have to. I'm talking about population, but you don't have really to sample millions of neurons in IOT Cortex to estimate or to reveal or actually to do downstream computation. So they seem to be very, very robust and very efficient quantities. And what is missing? Okay, so I think we have the knobs, we have all the parameters in the language of statistical mechanics. What we really miss, and I don't know, this is something that would be nice to actually come up with, and we have tried, and that's something that we don't know yet, and this to build a theory based on them, to actually show what is missing is to take a convolutional network and to show what are the parameters, what are the details of a visual hierarchy or another complex random, not random, recurrent neural networks, whatever. What are the key parameters of the underlying neural networks that controls this sensory, this all the parameters? Okay, so to have kind of a dynamical phenomenological theory or some not only cross-graining the patterns themselves as we did here, but actually to have a better understanding by some cross-graining of the underlying structure, and to say, well, what's important is this aspect of the network or this aspect of the learning or something like that. So actually to develop a full theory that takes some key cross-grained parameters of the networks and relate them to the evolution, to the emergence of these macroscopic geometric properties of concepts. Thank you.